I'm really glad that we managed to have Ognjen Kojanić, who is with us today. Ognjen is a cultural anthropologist and labor organizer based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He earned his PhD in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. His dissertation research focused on the case of ITAS, a Croatian metalworking company, which is often touted as a rare example of workers' shareholding in Southeast Europe and a successful attempt to build an alternative to capitalist property relations. In his dissertation, he examined the constraints of peripheral capitalism that ITAS workers' shareholders are trying to overcome. Moreover, he has published in journals such as the Anthropological Journal of European Cultures and in Dialectical Anthropology, to name just a few. And he is also a prolific writer for a variety of other platforms. Today, his presentation is titled, This Machine Should Be in a Museum, Managing Unevenness in a Worker-Owned Company. And from here, without any further ado, I will hand over to Ognjen, and please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to your seminar, and especially to Yuli, who extended the invitation first. And I'm very glad to meet the other organizers and see some friendly faces in the audience today. As I'm no longer in academic settings most of the time, I'm really looking forward to opportunities like this when I can hopefully get some comments and tough questions on the things that I'm working on. So what I'll be talking about today is a section from a chapter in my dissertation that I'm reworking for a journal article. And it is very much a work in progress, so any comments and questions will be welcome on my end. So without further ado, I'll start my stopwatch to just know how much time I'm spending and share my screen. And if you have trouble seeing this or anything, just please unmute yourself and let me know about it. Otherwise, I won't be able to see you. Okay, so like most anthropologists, I like to start with a vignette. So I'll start there. I was hanging out with Dražen, a lathe operator in his early 60s. I started taking photographs of Dražen's machine, and he told me I shouldn't photograph machines that belonged in a museum. He was using a manual turret lathe that you can see on this picture here, which could hold several tools that could be used in rapid succession without replacing the workpiece. He was somewhat proud when he explained that it was a forerunner of modern computer numerically controlled, or CNC machines, which operated on the same principle, except for the fact that they replaced the tools automatically. And yet, Dražen often complained to me about his machine, saying that he was too tired to operate it. It required him to, quote unquote, bang on it constantly to make it work properly. Operating this machine did seem very tiresome to me, even though the pieces he was working on were quite small. He told me that he was considering asking management if he could get the machine instead of the severance pay that he was entitled to upon retiring. So I asked him if he would like to continue working with it in his free time, and he started laughing and said that he was not even sure. He had a small vineyard, a big orchard, and a big garden that he enjoyed working in much more than on this machine. So as old workers in ITAS retired, their machines sometimes got retired as well, if no one was trained to use them. Dražen thought that would happen to his machine in 4 years or so that he had left in ITAS before he could retire. So he would rather keep it himself than see it sold as scrap, although he wasn't sure of whether he would ever use it again. At the same time, he thought that they couldn't make a lot of money even if they sold the machine for scrap. He explained that Germany could start subsidizing the replacement of old diesel cars, and people might start importing them and flooding the market. which meant that old cars in Croatia would go to dumps and therefore lower the price of scrap metal. So I chose this vignette and the title that you read to introduce the conundrum that thinking about old machines in Nytas presented, since Dražen articulated it very nicely in this case. Two main contradictory ideas were usually in tension here. One, the machines were used productively to manufacture high quality goods that could be sold on the international market. And most of Nytas' income came from producing pieces or even whole machines for German companies. Over 50% at the time of my research was based on export. According to the general view of technological evolution, there was the opposite view, which meant that old machines were generally seen as obsolete and in need of replacement by modern machines that would be more productive. But even breaking it down into these two ideas is kind of a simplification. So on the first point, it was complicated by the fact that old machines required a lot of physical exertion to operate, and they occasionally broke down, etc. The second point was complicated by the fact that if old machines were to be discontinued, workers worried about the fact of what was the future then, what would happen to those machines? Would they be sold for scrap? Would they actually be replaced by new machines, as that idea of constant technological evolution would suggest they should be? So workers like Dražen, old workers in Nytas, displayed ambivalent attachment to machines, which grew out of intimate knowledge of how a machine operated and that quality work could still be performed using it, while at the same time being obsolete and tiresome to operate. And that's only for old machines. Presumably, new machines were supposed to be unquestionably better, more productive, etc. But that was definitely not the case. So a little bit of context for this. When I say old machines and new machines, the fact was that at the time of my research, the average age of machines in this company was around 35 years. And a large number of old machines were still used daily at the time. 3 generations of metalworking technology coexisted in this company, ranging from a 60-year-old manual machine, the oldest machine in the factory, to a 1-year-old computer numerically controlled machine. In general, the majority of manual machines were obtained by the year 1990, and I'll just refer to them for simplicity's sake as old machines. The new machines, or computer numerically controlled CNC machines, have been bought after the workers' takeover in 2007. Nytas workers usually juxtapose the 2 generations of technology. There was also a small number of numerically controlled machines, which was kind of like a step between these 2 generations of technology, but they are not really important for this present discussion, so I won't go into that. So, new machines introduced new conundrums here. First, they were extremely expensive and hard to afford for Nytas. Over 10 years after the takeover, the company had only purchased 9 of them. Furthermore, while they were faster compared to old machines, new machines required new skills, not just from operators, but also from engineers who programmed them. Thus, they introduced an additional step in the production process that could slow things down in Nytas. Finally, because of high turnover among young workers who typically operated them, the cost of training and mistakes that new workers made was also an important factor here. So for all of these reasons that I outlined, there were no straightforward ideas about the value of machines in practice. Even taking into account the generational split, I could show you some of the new ones and the old ones here. So even taking into account the generational split between workers into young workers who typically operated new machines and old workers who typically operated old machines, even that generational split could not account for all the scrambled ideas about machines. So if you go back to the vignette that I started with, Dražen held all of these contradictory ideas at the same time. So how can we account for this variety of views? In this talk, I want to consider these ideas with regard to the arguments that some anthropologists have made about the fetish character of machines in capitalism. Contrary to some anthropologists' view of industrial machinery as a fetish that mystifies capitalist relations of production, I argue that approaching machines ethnographically can allow us to glimpse penetrating insights into economic unevenness that workers articulate on the shop floor. Dwelling on the coexistence of different generations of technology in this company, workers express their views on their inclusion in the market for metalworking and the global division of labor. And the fact that the company was owned by workers allowed them to reflect on the ways in which decisions about machines managed that unevenness in which they could find themselves, and how the management of unevenness has transformed from socialism to post-socialism. So I've used the term unevenness here. There are many ideas about unevenness, uneven development, or sometimes uneven and combined development. So going back in this genealogy, we can go all the way to Marx, and then later on theories of imperialism by Lenin, Luxemburg, then Trotsky's ideas about permanent revolution, etc. But more recently, it has become an academic concept used primarily by human geographers, and recently by some anthropologists like Sharon Casimir and Leslie Gill, who I follow here. So I use the term unevenness and as they think of it, and I can read this quote: "Unevenness is not simply the result of capital's omnipotence, nor the working out of its inherent tendencies. Rather, it is tied to struggle. If power coalesces in some places, and social relationships and networks become dense, whereas in other places they recede, we need a keener eye on how the struggles between labor, capital, and the state make these lumps. A systematic theory that situates multiplicity and complexity within a relational and differentiated conception of capitalist development grounds social change in the clash and bang of unequal power relations and constructs an oppositional ideology capable of explaining how the world is socially configured, how it can be transformed, and by whom." So the key intervention that they are making here is centering labor in this triadic relationship between labor, the state, and capital. And not just saying capital is omnipotent, not just saying it's all about state regulations that form a framework for capitalism, but also crucially introducing this agency of labor through political struggles in shaping how unevenness unfolds. Okay, moving forward. So I also want to go into this idea of fetishism, and I'm trying really hard to be very fair to these authors who've written about it and to outline what I'm agreeing with and also what I think needs to be challenged to a degree. So probably the first argument about the fetishistic character of technology was articulated by Brian Pfaffenberger. He wrote about irrigation systems in Sri Lanka and was arguing against what he identified as two widespread views of technology. So one of them is technological somnambulism, as he calls it, which is the idea that a tool is just a tool, it's divorced from its social and cultural context, anyone can use it, it doesn't really matter, it will always have the same results. The other idea he's arguing against is technological determinism, or the idea that a tool determines the structure of society and its development. So having certain tools means that you are at a certain level of societal and cultural development. And he writes, so there is indeed a hidden unity underlying these positions that seem to stand apart in apparent contradiction. Technology, under the sway of Western culture, is seen as a disembodied entity, emptied of social relations, and composed almost entirely of tools and products. It stands before us, in other words, in what Marx would call fetishized form. What is in reality produced by relations among people appears before us in a fantastic form as relations among things. You'll notice that he was not necessarily writing about industrial machinery, he was just writing about technology in general. So writing more specifically about machines, we have ideas by Alf Hornborg, who articulated a similar view and elaborated it further and has written extensively about the fetishism of machines. So he writes, No less than ritual, machines mystify us by pretending to be productive independently of exchange rates. In modern capitalism, however, the mystified exchanges have become even more opaque than in pre-modern ritual, and the magic agency of fetishized objects has become compelling in completely new ways. For the operation of the current global order to continue, it is no doubt essential that the billions of people whose daily labor maintains the asymmetric flows of energy and matter to these areas do not recognize in the objects composing that infrastructure the products of their own life force. And then most recently, we have Massimiliano Molona writing about a Brazilian steelmaking company, a giant of, I don't know, more than 20,000 workers directly or independent or indirectly employed by them. And Molona writes, on the UPV shop floor, technological fetishism involves a similar lopsided relationship between people and objects, whereby machines are seen as living gods, animating and empowering humans, and humans as inert byproducts of broader technological and economic forces. Indeed, technological fetishism is a central mechanism of class reproduction on the CSN shop floor, where the magical vitality of steel, which seems to transcend human agency, is responsible for the lopsided relationship between labor and the superhuman forces of capital embodied in the empty signifiers of depreciation, productivity, and profit. These social technologies of capitalism are enchanting, mesmerizing, and deceptive. Their power is aesthetic as much as it is material. So I'll stop here, no more big quotes. You can thank me for that later. So while these authors don't cite one another necessarily, they articulate a more or less the same idea of how technology, and in particular industrial machines, operate as a concrete abstraction. And to that extent that they are talking about the societal level of how capitalism operates, how it's structuring relations among people in the global economy, I don't necessarily have a problem with this argument. However, when we try to look for these ideas as they are supposed to be presented to us in the real world ethnographically, it appears as a search for a certain false consciousness, and I think that most anthropologists are not really comfortable applying all of these notions of false consciousness directly to people that we are working with. So individuals who use technology daily have very sophisticated ideas about the technology that they use. So for example, if we go back to Hornborg, who's talking about machines appearing as a decontextualized entity, how properties that belong to living organisms, such as productivity, are ascribed to machines and not to people. Global terms of trade are somehow obscured and conflated in this case. Global division of labor appears object controlled as opposed to controlled by humans, etc. But that's not actually what I encountered in my research. People who use machines understand on a very practical, incontrovertible level how machines' productivity stems from their own labor. And moreover, they tend to think about global relations of unevenness, as I will illustrate here. So let's go a bit deeper into this story about old machines in Nitis. Most old machines I saw in Nitis had been produced in Yugoslavia and at one point considered ahead of their time. These machines outlined the history of industrialization and development of underdeveloped parts of Yugoslavia. After the war, companies like Prvomajska played an active role in helping other parts of Yugoslavia develop machine tool industry. Prvomajska, this big consortium basically that also included ITAS at the time, would pass on the know-how and technical documentation to other companies, which is how ITAS grew out of the Ivanec coal mine. Ivanec is the town where it is located. This coal mine is now defunct, but at the time in the 60s, ITAS was basically a workshop within this coal mine until Prvomajska, this bigger socialist company from Zagreb, came, gave them some technology, transferred some know-how, and eventually incorporated them into that bigger system. So technology transfer responded to the political goal of developing the underdeveloped regions and towns in Yugoslavia. But it also responded to market pressures, as technologically more advanced companies like Prvomajska, the majority of whose productive facilities were located in Zagreb, could pass on less profitable elements of their production to places where wages were lower. The majority of the machines carried the name Prvomajska in the ITAS factory, but machines produced by other Yugoslav companies were represented as well. So, for example, Potisje, Livnica, Kikinda, Majevica, Ivo Lola Ribar, which are names that would ring a bell to many machine users in the former Yugoslavia, because these companies were very, very important for that part of the industry. Since the fall of socialism, many of these other companies have become a shade of their former selves, if they exist at all. Old workers remember these companies as industrial giants that developed manufacturing capacity of Yugoslavia and put the country on the world map of machine tool production. So a ranking, for example, published by American Machinists placed Yugoslavia on the 11th spot in the world in 1987, despite the small size of Yugoslavia and the relatively quote unquote backward character of its industry immediately after the Second World War. So you can see that trajectory of very fast development and growth in Yugoslavia in global terms. Also, whenever I would walk through ITAS, I would also see all these other machines produced by non-Yugoslav companies. So they would shed light on the geography of international trade in the early post-war era. The oldest machines in ITAS were from the USSR, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And this period of socialist development was marked by technology transfer deals that allowed Yugoslav companies to take over the technologies of other companies, usually West or East German ones. And then Yugoslav machine tool producers fulfilled the majority of domestic needs and over time increased their exports to help the country service its foreign debt. Yugoslavia achieved a considerable level of development relatively quickly by relying on a combination of imports and the creation of domestic research institutes. However, sweeping changes in the direction of more liberalization that began in the late 1980s sped up in the 1990s after the breakup of Yugoslavia. Constitutional and legislative changes in Croatia transformed social property, which was the dominant form of property in Yugoslavia, and it was transformed into private property. And first, the Croatian government nationalized those socially owned enterprises and subsequently privatized them, usually by floating their stocks so that various individuals could buy them. ITAS was one of the rare enterprises from the former Prvomajska system that managed to survive this process. However, the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the opening of the Eastern Bloc to imports from the West resulted in two waves of layoffs in ITAS during the 1990s. And they were also unable to invest in machines for almost 2 decades. So basically since the end of the 80s until they took over the company in 2007, until the workers took over the company after that brief period of the private ownership in ITAS. The Croatian economy as a whole shrunk due to the wartime efforts, material destruction, and human casualties between 1991 and 95. At the same time, high inflation and the breakdown of the former international Yugoslav market, formerly internal Yugoslav market, had a severe impact on the economy. New owners of privatized companies, as was the case in ITAS, in the manufacturing sector, they typically lacked plans to run privatized companies because they only bought them with an eye towards selling their assets rather than developing their products. After the wartime isolation ended, the government stabilized the economy in a way that favored imports and crushed the local manufacturing companies that had already stagnated after years of being cut off from the foreign market. So this whole time in the 1990s, early 2000s, The odds were against ITAS, but the enterprise managed to defy them by maintaining exporting ties with certain foreign companies. That changed when an individual connected to the local and regional political scene became the majority shareholder in 2001. Their business decisions, workers saw as bleeding the company dry, basically. Despite the improved economic prospects in the country, in part due to the expansion of consumer credit and debt-financed government spending, the position of ITAS workers was worsening in this period. They were becoming disenchanted with the management practices of private ownership in their company. They believed that the new owner was not interested in maintaining production, but was trying to make a quick profit by selling off its assets, which included machines. Workers entered into a protracted conflict with management between 2003 and 2006, in which they employed various tactics, including work stoppages, the occupation of the factory, and a hunger strike. As the union representative who led his colleagues in this struggle put it, quote, "The essence of everything was to save the machines that were in the factory and prevent anyone from unscrewing and taking out any of the machines," end quote. Workers' control over the company was recognized at the end of this prolonged battle in 2006 in a bankruptcy process. The workers were successful in converting unpaid salaries and other debts of the company towards them, and that made them actually the biggest creditor of the company. So they converted that debt into shares of the new legal entity. And they restarted production in 2007 as a new legal entity. The company managed to buy out the shares of other creditors and maintain production since then. Croatia became a member of the European Union several years later in 2013. While the EU membership facilitated easier export of ITAS products, the overall economic climate in Croatia had a negative influence on its continued survival. Having turned away from industrial production, the economic strategy of the country nowadays focuses largely on the service sector. So ITAS was facing serious liquidity problems, which the Croatian banking sector had a hard time alleviating in this case. So moving on to new machines. New machines were presumably there to help ITAS position itself better on the metalworking market. But again, things were not straightforward. First, ITAS could not easily purchase new machines. The cost of new CNC machines ranges from tens of thousands to millions of US dollars. Even new refurbished machines, which the company sometimes bought to save money, could cost upwards of $10,000. And in this picture on the left, you can see one big machining center that they bought during the time I spent there in 2018. That was a certified refurbished machining center, maybe 3 or 4 years old at the time, and it cost around 100,000 euros. And bear in mind, this is a company that has a total income of $5.1 million. That was in 2017, and roughly half of it was going to pay out workers' salaries. So about 2.5 million would go to salaries, and all of the rest had to be, paid out to suppliers, utility companies, et cetera, et cetera. So these price tags for new machines were very high for ITAS. And they meant that ITAS needed to apply for loans from banks or negotiate directly for preferential sales with the companies from which it purchased these new machines. Sometimes ITAS bought machines using lease-to-own arrangements, which could have very restrictive terms. For example, certain machines required a code generated monthly by the bank, which ITAS only got after a loan payment was made. So if they couldn't meet their loan payment, they could not use the machine. While manual machines can easily be operated with hand-drawn technical drawings and less sophisticated tools, the productivity of CNC machines is dependent on the quality of tools and computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing software used for them. The sophistication of tools and machines is constantly increasing, which allows the companies that produce them to extract value from them through various schemes after they are sold. For example, these companies can charge for regrinding tools or performing regular maintenance or repairs that ITIS's own maintenance department could not perform on their own. This added more expenses to an already cash-strapped company such as ITIS. Furthermore, since the operation of these machines requires different types of activities and designated programmers in addition to operators, they add more people to payroll. In smaller series, additional activities and more workers involved can make the manufacturing process more complicated, and it can take longer than if the same work was done on a manual machines. So in big series, that's not a problem. If you need to machine, I don't know, 1,000 pieces of whatever, these CNC machines would be way faster because you only need to put the workpiece in, let the machine do its thing, and take the workpiece out. But in smaller series, which because of the nature of ITIS production for this niche market that they had a lot of very, very small series, like 3, 5, 10 pieces they would have to produce at one time. So going through the hassle of programming and setting up the machine actually took way longer than just doing it on a manual machine. Finally, young ITIS workers tended to be less experienced than the old ones. Some ITIS workers were hired to be fully trained on the job. The lack of experience meant that they sometimes made serious mistakes. The effort required to train young workers and occasionally fix their mistakes created significant costs and delays, which reduced the new machine's productivity. Old workers also saw young workers as being paid more than they deserved, which created a rift between the two groups. Even more frustrating for old workers was the fact that many young workers did not stay in ITIS very long. Like other metalworking companies in this part of Croatia, ITIS was constantly dealing with a shortage of qualified workers. Due to the proximity of EU countries that pay higher salaries, notably Germany, Austria, even Slovenia, it was common for young people to emigrate and start or continue their careers abroad. For this reason, many young workers used their time in ITIS to learn the trade and, after a couple of years or even less, apply for work in companies that could pay them better. As one old worker, whom I call Zlatko, put it, quote, "You can have whichever machine in the world you want. If you don't have a worker to operate it, it is no good to you." At least 10 young workers will leave ITIS soon. And at the time, ITIS had around 200, a little bit less than 200 workers. So that was a significant number for this factory. So going back to what Zlatko said, at least 10 young workers will leave ITIS soon. Their future employer will take a skilled worker. He won't need 2 years to learn things. He won't break things. He won't mess things up. Their salaries will be about $150 higher, and they will screw us over. This generational difference, coupled with the difference between old and new machines, engendered complex negotiations regarding authority and knowledge between old and young workers, as well as between blue-collar workers and engineers. And these negotiations did not take place in a vacuum. Rather, they were part of the uneven geography of manufacturing that requires constant innovation so that the company can survive in the market for high-precision machine tools. Financial constraints were not the only factors that shaped the contingent outcomes of machinery replacement. The low price of labor, the proximity to Germany and other countries that were better positioned in the global manufacturing market, reliance on unpaid labor within kinship structures, petty agricultural production, and moonlighting, to name a few that I can't really go into detail here about, they all played roles in determining the ways this process unfolded in this company. Thus, old machines continued to coexist with newer ones, and they could still be economically viable, even though not necessarily very productive and profitable. But indeterminate economic value was not the only interesting aspect of the coexistence of such a wide variety of machines in ITIS. As Martha Kaplan shows in her research on water infrastructures in the United States, economic value and commodity fetishism are only part of the explanation for the processes through which technologies get appropriated by individuals and groups who are using them. The coexistence of different generations of machines that were used in ETIS provided a fertile ground on which different visions of the company's future were articulated. A complete overhaul of the technology used, reorganization of the production cycle, and retraining of the workforce was financially impossible for this company. There were a number of workers who thought that such changes were necessary if ETIS were to survive in the market. They thought that finding a strategic partner from the same industry that would invest millions of dollars would be worth it to lose workers' control over the company. A desire for an injection of external capital made economic sense from the standpoint of workers in a company that needed to survive market competition. But simultaneously, these changes would limit what ETIS could do for its workers. Thus, having a strategic partner was interpreted by many as basically selling the company and consequently losing the ability to participate in making decisions about the company's future. The idea that ETIS should find a strategic partner, however, was not dominant. I said it's a handful of workers who did express that view, but most of them did not. The people who took a more active role in the decision-making processes were strongly opposed to the possibility of any outside actors taking over ETIS. As one worker observed, when there was gossip about the possibility that a big German company would invest 10 million euros in exchange for a stake in ownership, quote, "It won't happen. After all that people have gone through struggling for ownership in the early 2000s, there will be a new revolution." So they wanted the company to be able to pull itself up by its bootstraps, which required making the best use of the machines it already had. They were aware that ETIS workers needed to be able to, quote unquote, earn their own salaries, because there would be no help from the state or anyone else if the company could not survive on its own. Still, they thought that drawing investment by finding a new owner would be detrimental to the present structure of the company because the change might displace many workers. So the entwinement of old workers and their machines in the conditions of post-socialist capitalism in the European periphery still provided these workers with the ability to engage in some sort of low-level political deliberation, at least to a certain extent. Such engagements were not limited to sheer indicators of the company's market success as an economic unit, but allowed workers to consider the consequences and price of such success. Okay, and I will work towards my conclusion now to use the rest of the time I have. So I've recounted the arc of the management of unevenness in the ETIS case and how it is perceived from the shop floor. By focusing on ideas and practices of machine use, I uncovered how unevenness was managed under Yugoslav developmentalist state policies enacted within the Cold War geopolitical order, and then the dissolution of Yugoslavia and privatization that ensued, and then worker ownership finally. And it is important to underscore here that I reconstructed this arc mainly based on what workers told me. I also, during my research, used the archive of factory newspapers, but those were published by Prvomajska, the big system that it has belonged to in the socialist period. So ETIS was very peripheral in that system. It was small, so typically an issue would have one, maybe two, often none, nothing written about ETIS. So this is actually mainly from what workers told me, and I just put it into a more or less coherent story. So that kind of counters with what those authors that I quoted in the beginning, like Molona and Hornborg, write about. So for example, Molona says, working class culture is the long-term process through which labor articulates its needs, desires, and hopes in the light of contingent resources, the history and memories of past struggles, and the momentous structural forces of capital steering in directions that are difficult to predict or fathom from the worker's singular and particular locations. But as anthropologists, we always work with these individual perspectives that are partial and bounded, and we try to put them together, and then they can actually reveal a lot. So I don't think we can discount the views of these workers and just say, oh yeah, that's all fetishized technology. They don't really have sophisticated ideas about the machines they are using. Also, Alf Hornborg, whom I cited earlier, is against such particularity that anthropologists are famous for. So he thinks that the commitment to the case study approach may prevent us from, and this is a quote, may prevent us from gaining a truly holistic perspective on industrial technology as a global phenomenon and as a specific social form. Recent attempts at defetishizing technology tend to concentrate on specific technological systems in fairly restricted social contexts, end quote. But I think there is still a way to embrace this particularity and be able to contribute to understanding industrial technology as a global phenomenon and as a specific social form. So going back to the story of Vikas and what it shows us, my discussion shows how the profit motive became the dominant motive for enterprises in Croatia due to a set of political and economic changes over the past decades. But ITIS, as a worker-owned company with a large cohort of old workers who remembered the socialist period and had the experience of struggle for ownership over their company, managed to resist profit-seeking as the only motive for its continued existence. Knowledge and expertise, experience of belonging to an enterprise from the time of socialist self-management to the present, access to financing, and material properties of metalworking all shaped ideas about value in this company. However, the ability of ITIS workers to include non-economic considerations in their decision-making became increasingly constrained by its position in the highly competitive market for high-precision metalworking. So as factory infrastructures, like these machines, get recontextualized in different political economic systems, their users have to negotiate values in new ways. And negotiation of values is tied up in the process of material provisioning, which is evident in the ideas and practices of machine use on the shop floor. And I will stop there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Ognjen, and I think this was a really fascinating presentation, and there was so much in it that like I would immediately have at least 10 different questions, but I will limit myself to one for now, and maybe I have a chance to ask another one later. So first of all, I think this is a very unique case in these terms, at least, that it really rarely happens that you get to know about a factory that is owned by workers. This is what stands out immediately, and I would like to know a bit more about how the hierarchies in this factory are structured and how what kind of conflicts. You mentioned some conflicts, but immediately the one that comes from the more socialist perspective of work and the younger generation who have a different vision of what it means to work in a factory-owned company, maybe, and also what perspectives this factory have from your point of view. Like, is there a future perspective for this kind of production and for this kind of structure? And the last one, like, what are they actually producing there? Like, what is the material with which they are working except machines? And what is the product there? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. These are all great questions. So the question about the uniqueness of this case, it certainly is very unique. There are not many worker-owned companies in Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia, definitely. Over the past 20 years, I can name a handful that I know of, Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia, but definitely more an exception than a rule. And I think that's what makes it kind of like a natural experiment because of all of the changes that they've been through, this coexistence of old and new machines, this coexistence of old and new workers or young and old workers, which I mentioned, kind of makes it a very exceptional case that highlights all of these issues that I brought forward. I still think that, you know, we can trust workers who use their machines to have sophisticated ideas about them and about the global division of labor and unequal exchange, et cetera, et cetera. But you are right. I mean, I think that this case definitely shows that in a very heightened manner because of its own internal contradictions. So I wouldn't say that we can easily find all of these views in every company in the former Yugoslavia, let alone globally. With regard to conflicts, I didn't mention the generational conflict, which was on the shop floor, the main conflict. So there were these constant discussions about who is paid how much, who gets bonuses, who doesn't get bonuses. And it was typically divided according to the generations. And the reason was simple enough. When you talk to workers, to like the higher ups in the management who made those decisions, young workers had a better position because they were ready to move to Germany, to Austria, get higher salaries. So it was kind of like a no-brainer. If you want to keep them, you would have to pay them better. In practice, those differences were not huge. They would be like, I don't know, a 50 euro difference in salaries of, I don't know, let's say in a range of 600 to 700 euros. So substantial, but not huge. But they were really, really pronounced on the shop floor. And the dialectical anthropology article that you mentioned in the introduction is explicitly about those divisions on the shop floor. Obviously, there were divisions between blue collar and white collar workers. Those carry over from the socialist period. Ideas about regia and non-productive parts of a company as opposed to people who are actually working with their hands and producing, adding value to their products. That's a very typical thing that kind of carried over. And then there was an additional layer of like these new young engineers who are coming and maybe trying sometimes to change things up a little bit. There was a lot about that. And then finally, the future perspective, I've got to say, is very bleak. After I left this company, the number of workers has been declining steadily. I think now they have maybe around 120 workers. So about a third of the people who were there when I was doing my research just 3 years ago are gone. That's because some of their contracts with German companies were not renewed during the pandemic, etc. So people are just leaving the company, and that part is not great. And also it just, you know, continues to be hard for them to position themselves in this international market. And their products are machine tools and parts for machine tools. So basically they produce kind of the machines that other metal workers can use, or parts for other machines that metal workers use, just less sophisticated than the ones they are using in their own production.
Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, as it is mentioned in the chat, please just raise your hand or give a note in the chat box that you want to ask a question. The first one was Vlad, I think, so please go ahead.
Right, thank you. Yeah, yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's fascinating and resonates a lot with my own research. And that's why my question is, you show us this very interesting difference in the usage and in a way how the old machines and the new machines, that actually it's more complicated just to say, well, new machines are always better. And then my question actually is, was there any attempt to train the new workers, the young workers, to use the old machines? Or was that just the idea that it's the inexorable technological developments, old workers and old machines will be replaced forever, and then a new company will start from new workers and new machines, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. There were young workers who worked on classical machines, on manual machines. it was just a matter of what's needed in the production process at the time. So if they really needed someone to work on manual machines, it was crucial in their production cycle. Then when the old worker who retires or leaves the company for any other reason, they would be replaced, and they would, before they retire, they would retrain younger workers. But as a tendency, new machines were definitely usually operated by young workers because they required this a bit more sophisticated knowledge of computers that older workers kind of just didn't want to bother with. So there were a handful of older workers who did want to go through that training and did end up using these computer numerically controlled machines, but typically young workers were more ready to take that up.
Right, thank you.
Okay, so the next question comes from Andrew Thiemann, I think. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Ollie, for the presentation. I'm happy I could hear it now. Last week I missed it. My question would be a bit about the embeddedness of your case in the supply chains. You have been alluding to some German customers, but I would be interested in a way, what would be the universe for such a shop like ITAS in who could they actually work for, and would there be any chance for them to somehow upgrade their production, either in the way of going more into a niche or alternatively going more large scale? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's very complicated, and it has changed significantly since 2007 when they restarted production under worker ownership. In the beginning, they exported stuff to Venezuela, Russia, and European countries, or European Union countries. However, both countries are now sanctioned, so as a member of the EU, they cannot do that any longer, and that significantly hamstrung them. The most productive and profitable period after the workers' takeover was when they could actually export to Russia and Venezuela. But at the time of my research, two German machine tool companies, Kunzmann and Altmetall, basically had these big contracts with ITAS. Altmetall produces these like hand drills. So ITAS would deliver several hundred of those a year, like a fully completed product just based on Altmetall specs and without the ITAS name on it. So basically subcontracting in this case. The same goes for Kunzmann, which had bigger machines. So those were on the order of like 20 to 30 a year, but they were way more expensive. So that was still an important part of their productive process. And that was over 50% of what they were doing. The other things were much smaller. So they were cooperating with smaller shipyards in Croatia, for example, to produce parts for engines. They would cooperate with other metalworking companies in the region. And then, you know, if these other companies don't have certain machines, they would do a part of the process, but not the whole thing. So there was a lot of that, and that's why I said that a lot of it is like really niche production. So when, you know, an Austrian company doesn't want to deal with producing like 4 replacement parts that they will need in 2 months, they go to ITAS, and ITAS can do it because it makes more financial sense. And that was a big thing. After I left, they started developing these recharging stations for electric vehicles. But I don't think that was a huge contract, and they kept saying, oh, this is something we need to do. It's the future of auto industry to produce electric cars. But there is not a huge market for recharging stations in Croatia because there are not that many electric cars. So that was not a huge thing that could keep them afloat. And there was a lot of resistance to downscaling in the sense of the quality of their products. So it was anathema to talk about less sophisticated products like you can make a shovel with the machines they have, you can make a pickaxe, whatever. But they were like, no, you need like millimeter tolerances there, and we are working with micron, so 1,000th of a millimeter. Those are the tolerances. There's a lot of skill here, a lot of knowledge, and we don't want to produce like shovels and stuff like that. So there was a lot of that sort of pride that kind of limited what they wanted to do, even if it's way more productive to produce wheelbarrows and shovels than what they are doing, because there's, you know, a ready market really close to them, et cetera, et cetera. So that was another like non-economic consideration that was really important for them, and why they were potentially limiting themselves economically.
Yeah, thank you. I think ethos is a really interesting part of this whole research as well. So, but anyway, next one to go is Ian. Please go ahead.
Hi there. Hi. Yeah, thanks very much for that. It's really interesting for me because yeah, I just finished reading a book yesterday, which was, I mean, you mentioned Malona there, who did work in Sheffield as well, and the steel industry there. But the book I read was by David Hacken. It was looking at computerization in Sheffield in the 80s. And the effect it had on the working class in Sheffield then, at a time when computers were new and kind of fetishized in some respects, I suppose. But how these new machines affected the identity of the working class there, and the shifts, because it was a time when Thatcherism of sort of divisions within the socialist movement then, and all sorts of things, and computers were kind of seen either as a way of empowering people, perhaps, creating a new kind of working class identity based around computing, or on the other hand, being through the control of machines, being a way to control work, cut costs, and so forth. You know, so there's kind of this debate going on there, which actually seems quite similar in some respects there to the sorts of things going on with machines there in your particular case. So yeah, it was just interesting to me to see some of the parallels there, that this is probably something which will reoccur as far as new machines coming in, and the debates over what their effects will be. I think the sort of main conclusion is, and it's not necessarily, I mean, you talk first of all about fetishism of these machines, but I think a lot of the time it's more to do, what seems to be more to do with the way that they're implemented, whether the purchase decisions are the right ones, whether the actual working practices are taken into account when these new machines are integrated into the workplace and things like that. And you get with computers and other technologies, you get interesting. You talk about unevenness, but you get interesting shifts in the way skill is viewed. So you in this book it talks about kind of formal de-skilling, but substantive upskilling. So often to use the new machines, you need more knowledge because they're more complex and things like that. But at the same time, the prestige or even the wage of the pay gets lowered. So again, it's something which goes on there. So I don't know whether that was something you also saw, whether the attitude to people who ran the machines changed, as opposed to somebody who was considered a skilled operator and the job had prestige and downwards, and also whether it is about fetishization of technology, or whether it's just poor implementation of something which could be employed better. New machines could be better if they were, I mean, I can understand that it would be fetishization if you can just drop a new machine in there and then it's suddenly going to do better work and at less cost and make you more productive, which isn't the case usually. So, I mean, is fetishization the right word in this case, or is it just poor understanding of the technology that's being implemented and on all levels really, management and worker level perhaps? Is that the right word to use in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would use the concept of fetishism to talk about these people using machines and thinking about them and talking about them, or their management for that matter. Even management was aware that, these old machines are still productive, can produce high quality products, etc. So I think that the problem with that framework or thinking about fetishism is, I guess, the scale on which we are observing it. So as I said, on the societal level, makes sense. But when you dig deeper with the people who are actually using very particular technologies and thinking about this, whether we want to call it creative destruction or the evolution of technology or whatever that is usually celebrated by capitalists, I think we encounter these problems. And definitely, all of these things that you mentioned about Sheffield are relevant and pertinent. So the idea that if you don't take workers' perspectives into account, you will displace them in important ways and change their identities and self-perception, etc. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the work you mentioned by David Hacken, but
not very well known, but it's quite good. I can send you a link.
Thanks. Yeah.
Sorry. So I can't see any other hands raised for the moment. If there are any questions, please raise your hand now. Other than that, I will.
Steph's there.
Steph's there. Okay, I didn't see him. Sure, then Steph, please go ahead.
I did use my electronic hand before I used my real hand. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Ognjen. I think you made a convincing argument when it comes to the idea that these workers clearly they are capable of sophisticated vernacular reasoning, or whatever we want to call it, about global capitalism, basically, and about their place in it. And following on from what Ian and Vlad mentioned, I'd like to ask a question which is about learning. I don't know if it's learning is the best word, but I'm thinking of it as learning now. In relation to those old machines and new machines as well. As you pointed out, and as the workers themselves, I'm sure, constantly point out, a machine does only what you do with it, right? It can only be put to the good use, as every worker will always tell you, with the right knowledge and the right skills. So I'm wondering then specifically about the temporal dimension, let's say, of the learning, about the speed particularly of it. So presumably when we have old machines and new machines, presumably there's quite a discrepancy between them in those terms, in the sense that with old machines, as you explained, people learned to operate them 30 years ago, and they can still do that in 2019 when you are there to watch them operate them. So the learning, even though they've gotten better at it, the learning seems to be done once for a long time in the future. Whereas presumably, and this is hypothetical, I don't know, but you'll be able to tell us, with the new machines, I would expect that they become obsolete very quickly, and they get either replaced or changed. The software is changed. So in other words, the learning has to be much more continuous, I would imagine, and much quicker in order to get to the same, to put them to good use in the same way as you could put to good use the old machines. Now, I may be wrong about that, but if I'm not, do these workers also have, let's say, vernacular theories about those kind of issues, about the issues of skills and learning skills, and then the generational divide there?
I think that's yeah, a very interesting question that I did not think about too much. I mean, I did notice a lot of like these discussions about skill and knowledge. I think they were mostly some parts of the work process are the same. You still have to, learn how to measure the workpiece you're working on. You still have to know how to fasten it into your machine so that it doesn't, wiggle around and you actually can achieve what you need to achieve. You need to know how to measure things to make sure that you do your own quality control before the, the factory level quality control, etc. And those were some of the things that these older workers were actually passing on to young workers. A lot of them, as I mentioned, came without any previous knowledge of metalworking. Some of them would go to like a vocational school for it, but there was, the practical skills were not there yet. So there was a lot of passing on of those things, like how do you measure things, how do you fasten things, etc. So that part is pretty much always the same. But the part about actually operating machines is what's different, because with manual machines, obviously there's a lot of like cranking and positioning and bending and interacting with the machine. Whereas with these CNC machines, you set up the first one, you let the machine run it, check if everything is okay, and then you basically just plug in, redo the thing, take it out, plug in, redo the thing, take it out. So in that sense, even though potentially they can be obsolete, they can like not be as fast, they can, newer generations can maybe change tools faster or hold more tools or things like that. The basic operating principles of them would not get obsolete, even for these younger workers. So it's kind of hard to judge on that temporal scale. Like, I don't know, maybe there were some older CNC machines, like the first CNC machine started appearing in the 80s with the first computers. So there were still maybe one or two of those that ETIS workers used. And people who started in the 80s still knew how to operate a CNC machine. You just have to use maybe different technology to transfer those programs that you put into a machine to make it do what it needs to do. So I'm not sure that it like completely gets put to the wayside every several years.
All right, so we have another question from Yui first. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was trying to think of how to frame this, and I'm not sure I got to a very good point, but I'm going to try. So I was reading just now in the last couple of days, Laura Baer's special issue on speculation, and what I found really interesting about is how she asks more in terms of infrastructure, but I'm guessing it could work with machines, and also these deliberations about where to get the injection of money from and whether to accept it or not, is that the question becomes about sort of types of accumulation, and then you can kind of trace the different different ideas about where accumulation takes place and what kind of arrangement. And I thought that that was a really interesting thought generally, but also in terms of when you're talking about this guy saying, I'm going to take the machine home instead of severance pay, like this kind of idea of what's worth what, and yeah. But I was also thinking in terms of speculation, like that seems to be, she defines it as something that happens through a truth event. So a certain kind of articulation of bringing together different kinds of things to make a case for profitability, or a case for a different kind of accumulation. Like, for example, when the workers get together and they say we can take care of our workers better if we keep this in our own hands and we don't let the Germans come in, then But I'm guessing in this sense, the question would be is whether who makes these kind of decisions about speculation, about figuring out what is a good kind of decision, and their relationship to the machines. And I was wondering if you can say more about it.
That's a whole rabbit hole that I did not go into in this talk because there's just so much to talk about there. When it comes to these hierarchies of decision making, even though the company was nominally worker owned and had some structures to deal with that ownership structure. So for example, big meetings where everyone was supposed to attend and kind of talk to the CEO of the company and the management board and whatever. They were open to everyone, but in practice, people did not really participate. Then there was also a shop floor committee, which was supposed to be a democratizing institution that represented about, I don't know, 15 to 20 people would sit on it. Again, in principle, open to anyone who wants to attend, take part, talk to those other people. In practice, it was, low-level managers there and engineers sitting with the CEO and making recommendations. And then finally, the management board, which was actually empowered to make decisions with the CEO and even orders CEO to do things in particular ways. So I would say that even though in principle they could take part in these decisions, it was mostly in informal ways, like talking to the person who is kind of the gray eminence of the company behind the scenes. Like he would often walk around the factory just chatting with people, and they would maybe share their perspectives when they thought that was useful for him to hear, and then he would incorporate that and push for it at the management board meetings and shop floor committee meetings. So it's that part is kind of interesting and complicated, and in practice things were not working the way they were as advertised for external audiences. And then I think the funny thing about it is that these, even though they were really economic considerations, like which machines you want to use, as you were saying, connecting it with Bear, they were usually not explicitly made. Like there was this idea, yeah, we need to buy new machines so that we could, raise productivity. But whenever you started like really digging deep, like there were no calculations done by anyone that would demonstrate like this is, how productive these old machines are. This is what we can do. This is how much we can earn when we use them, as opposed to a different machine. So these, these, what you call them, truth events, or what Bear calls them, did not really occur that often for me to perceive. So they were kind of, I would glean them from these practices and these conversations about machines that were ostensibly about other things, like, oh, I'm really tired operating this machine, but the younger worker whom I trained for a year to use it, it was no big deal for him, but then he left and now he is working in Slovenia for a bigger salary. And then you kind of piece it together through these conversations. They were not explicitly discussed and thematized. Like there would be glimpses sometimes, but they were not the main discussions. Does that answer your question? More or less.
Okay, let's move on to next questions. We have Tom who goes first, please.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask more about this, and we've talked about it a lot, but this ambivalent attachment to these various machines. And you talk about the distinction between, if you can say, digital and analog machines, or computers, or kind of the older machines, and that actually this kind of distinction of more or less obsolescence doesn't really hold. And so I just wanted to, maybe I just missed it, because I think you brought real nuance in how that distinction doesn't really hold. But in terms of your title, or the first part of your title, this machine should be in a museum, I was kind of wondering how typical that was, because you mentioned it in your first description, but actually the more I hear, the more it seems how integral they are in how people, you know, newer workers who learn in the factory, that in certain situations the older machines can do more tasks more quickly. So yeah, maybe it's a simple question, just like how typical was that? You know, maybe I've just missed something, but I got a sense that they still have a real, you know, they still arrange work and labor within the factory in really important ways, and for the workers in there. Yeah, so it'd be great to hear more on that.
Yeah, in the past, I wasn't using these like first part of the title that's kind of evocative of the ethnography, and I've tried it with multiple versions with this chapter and this paper, and nothing seems to stick. So I will probably change the one I used for this talk, and that's also fine. You know, it happens until you polish something until the end. I want to try to capture this idea that, you know, it's still, yes, you know, people may think that it is old, obsolete. In general, that's how the Western view of technology would describe it that way. But still, like when you go in, things are more complicated than that. Actually may not work that way. Even if people will occasionally tell you, I'm so tired of this machine, I just wish I didn't do it. Or I just wish we didn't have this anymore, we didn't use it. It still was very important. So yeah, it does not capture that complexity and ambivalence and ambiguity that actually exists in the world. So thanks for drawing my attention to it. Whenever I sent it to Yuli, I was busy with other things at work. So I just had to come up with a pithy title that might draw an audience. And thank you all for coming. I see that it did its part. Sorry if that's a bit disappointing of an answer.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the challenge of the title. Anyway, Joanna, you go next, please.
Hi, thanks so much for that. I really enjoyed it. I have a question around maybe practices of maintenance and ideas of self-sufficiency. Just hearing you talk about these different ideas around, you know, old machines, newer machines, it reminded me of something that I realized when I was doing fieldwork, which was in a very different context, but where machines were also involved, but they were involved in the making of woolen yarn and preparation of wool to be taken to be woven. And the kind of context was also very different. But I was interested in finding parallels in terms of thinking about the value of older machines and how workers talked about them, but in terms of maintenance. So where I did fieldwork, it was quite far from, so it was in the Western Isles of Scotland. So to travel there takes a 2 hour and 50-minute ferry, and it's very far away from urban centers once you get to the mainland. And so there was all of this idea around, you know, newer machines bring other complications which have to do with parts are harder to get, but also you'll need specialized engineers to come and fix them if something went wrong. And so there was all this idea about, you know, everyday maintenance of machines within the mill, and a lot of it was sometimes involving tinkering or coming up with ways of using materials that were around, because also waiting for spare parts would be too expensive, or sometimes they just wouldn't come up, and you can't stop the whole production within the mill because of that. And so there was this idea that the older machines allowed people to kind of tinker in a way that the newer ones, you can't really go in the same way that you maybe would try to fix a car. So this kind of was related to also, you know, ways in which people fixed other kinds of machines in the islands as well. But I found that interesting because it meant that even though some of the newer machines would maybe produce better yarn, or like the yarn wouldn't have as many lumps, things like that, that still there was a disparity given to acquiring machines from older mills sometimes, because it made it easier to kind of access the inside and to be able to actually have some control over, you know, the machines being able to continue working and, you know, the whole thing. And so I found it interesting because in this case you were working or you were learning from people who were working with machines that make machine parts and parts for machine tools. And so I was just curious about this in terms of maintenance as well, whether, you know, this was something that, in addition to being a company that was worker owned, so that the workers owned the means of production really, so the machines were owned by the workers, whether this idea that you'd also own the ability to maybe make some of the parts for those machines if there was any problem, whether that was the case, and if so, if they could actually do that, if there was some ability to make spare parts in-house without having to depend on others, or on importing parts, expensive parts from other parts of the world, whether that was something that that might be interesting to think about in terms of the place of a worker-owned company in these particular capitalist forms and within these international kind of supply chains. So I was just wondering in terms of that, whether there's some sort of, whether it could be productive to think about maintenance and the maintenance of machines and this idea of self-sufficiency and kind of thinking about other models of kind of having these projects work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That really resonates with what I saw there, because like these older machines, they would break down more often, but they were easier to fix. So it wasn't such a big deal. You know, you stopped for a day, the maintenance crew comes tomorrow, fixes it, and you're back to work. Whereas if a new machine broke down, and if the warranty period was over, then you would have to bring external folks to fix it. You would have to again order spare parts that might come from very far away, so you would have to wait on that as well. And then you would have to pay for it eventually, because your own in-house maintenance crew could not do it most of the time if they were big things. So the maintenance crew was in charge of like maintaining them on a daily level, doing some small repairs, but everything big had to actually, if you had a Japanese Niigata machine, you would have to call a Niigata crew, and it wouldn't be even in Croatia. So who knows, they would come from Germany or Austria or whatever to fix it. So that definitely created problems. But even with these old machines, the maintenance crew was not big enough to kind of really maintain them well. And I would occasionally see, leakages that people just throw sawdust on so that, oil does not spill all over the factory. But they were, workers would be pissed about it and like, oh, come on, how long do I have to wait for them to actually come and replace, I don't know, one pipe in this machine for oil or something like that. So yeah, it was not ideal even with these old machines, just because the number of people who were actually in charge of maintenance was not enough for the advanced age of those machines. And another thing was that I don't go into here in this talk, but there was something that I wrote about in the dissertation, is how you actually deal with those imperfections after a while and how much skill it actually takes. Like, your machine very intimately, that it's gonna be, I don't know, 1 micron or 5 microns off in this corner, but not in this corner. So how you set up and finagle the machine and the piece that you're putting there is really important. And if someone comes to your workplace when you're on holiday, they might not know it. So there's that like long-term relationship to machines that I didn't really go into here. But yeah, very important stuff. Thanks.
That's really interesting. So do they actually make some of the parts that they would be able to use to repair some of the machines in-house?
I am not sure. I guess it would depend. Like, they could produce some metal parts, but you would actually have to have all of the specs, and you would have to design the technological process. So I guess in some cases, it would just be easier to get it somewhere else.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So we have one more question from Anthony Barge. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's very interesting. Just a couple of questions, really. One was, you mentioned that Yugoslavia's development depended on imports and domestic R&D, or some kind of domestic capacity to improve firms' abilities to produce, etc. And I just wondered and you also said that their ECAS, they couldn't overhaul their technology. So I'm asking, what was available in terms of that R&D support, or in terms of trying to change the technology towards meet their own goals? And the second question is, you mentioned the workers had a sophisticated understanding of their technology, etc. Why did the worker think that the machine should be in a museum? Yeah, that's for Oggy.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so the question of Yugoslav development, I kind of jumbled some 45 years of development policies into half a paragraph there. Basically, in the early period, right after the Second World War, the country was struggling on so many different fronts. In the 50s, they started these programs of, importing machines from the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, West Germany sometimes, and they would start using those. And over time, they would develop their own capacities. So for example, Prvomajska, the Zagreb big system that ITIS belonged to in the socialist period, had its own institute with dozens, if not hundreds, of engineers who were constantly developing new technologies. So in other places, they were developing their own numerically controlled and computer numerically controlled machines at the end of the Yugoslav period. But then, as I said, in the 90s, that all kind of crashed. The internal market was broken down. All of those problems made sure that the institute does not exist anymore. And then the same thing kind of happened in ITIS. There was a shrinkage of that department that was in charge of, creating new products, innovating and advancing designs, etc. In-house. So they had, I don't know, some 10 to 15 people at their highest, in the 80s when they had around 1,000 workers, they had a whole department devoted to that. But that was no longer the case after the 90s. Like those were some of the first people to leave, also because they were engineers who could cash in with their skills elsewhere. And then why did he think it was in a museum? Because there was in the back of his mind this idea that it is an obsolete technology that makes you very tired when you have to operate it, when you're 60 years old and have to constantly like bang on it to make it work. Even though he was producing pieces that were just a couple of inches big, and it wasn't really because he had to lift heavy things and stuff. It was just the repetitive motions, the constant, lifting and bending, standing up, etc., etc. So he was kind of just tired of operating a manual machine at that point, and he thought that it's just ITIS was slowly losing that race of technological development at the time. So those things would probably fit in a museum because they aren't used in other countries that are more developed, in his view. But as I said, it was complicated. That was one idea held at the same time as this is productive. I can still make use of this here and potentially even when I retire.
Thanks.
All right. So I think we're slowly coming to an end as well here. That has been a fascinating discussion. And I would just have one last question for you, asking about any future projects. Is there something that we can look forward to? Is there something that you're working on at the moment? So.
Yeah, so as I'm rewriting this paper to submit it somewhere, I'm also thinking about future dissertation revisions into a book manuscript, and I'm about to start a new project. I just got a Wenner grant, post-PhD grant to start a project. Thank you. It was actually unexpected, but it happened, so I'm happy. So the next project will be about infrastructure development in wetland areas in Belgrade over the period of the past 100 years or so, and how under different political economic regimes, infrastructure development reflected very different values and also allowed various contestations to happen. So stay tuned. Hopefully I'll have something to present at the AAAs later this year about that.
Amazing, congratulations. That sounds really, really interesting.
If I can use the opportunity to once again thank everyone for your attention and thoughtful questions and comments on this. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think we all enjoyed this as well. Thank you very much. And I would like to take the chance to announce our seminar next week as well, where we will have Dr. Charlotte Bruckerman as a speaker from the University of Cologne. And her talk is titled "The Value of Low Carbon Citizens, Planting Digital Carbon in the Chinese Desert." So that also sounds very interesting. And yeah, I mean, we're happy if you check our Facebook group, which has been posted in the chat, as well as sharing the record of our seminar series with friends and colleagues. And yeah, and also have a look at the sessions that you might have missed earlier. And I think that's all for today. Thanks everybody for coming, for joining in, and looking forward to see you all next Wednesday, 4 p.m. UCT +1, so British time. Okay.
Thanks all, bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.